Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Mothman horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story, the Valian, possibly Mothman? Glad to live in Tucson once again. I used to live in a city called Vail, Arizona. For those who don't know, it shouldn't really be called a city. It's more scattered, newish housing developments separated from each other by long stretches of two-lane roads surrounded by huge expanses of desert, with barbed wire fence, spotted on the sides with spiny trees, all kinds of cacti, and some cattle here and there. It's a little desolate, and at night, dead quiet. About a year back, my group of friends started suddenly talking about their sightings of some weird thing out in the desert and near the roads. I told them their descriptions sounded an awful lot like Mothman. Only this thing didn't have wings, but they had never heard of Mothman. Although I'd like to know something else is out there and physically see it, I was pretty skeptical. I didn't want to doubt my friends when this had seemed to freak them out so much, but some could be a bit dramatic, so I took their stories with a grain of salt. They thought it was some kind of alien, and our quest for the summer became to find the Valian. Now to the actual story later that year. In the middle of winter, these things were far from my mind. After I had moved back into town, I was visiting a friend who lived just where I used to live in Vail. I stayed over pretty late working on a music project. At about 1 to 2 a.m., I left his house to drive about 25 minutes down a long stretch of road back home. I had started feeling fine about driving by myself late at night and had no worries. Driving about 50 miles per hour, blasting Led Zeppelin, when approaching a cattle guard on a rise in the road, I saw a silhouette. Before I even processed the fact I was seeing something, I realized I had slowed and eventually stopped to get a better look. The cattle guard stood between this thing and me. It was about 10 yards off, more or less, standing almost in the middle of the road, and from how the road was rising, I could only see about from the hips up. It was very tall and humanoid-looking, skinny, with lanky arms and skin that looked brownish, leathery, and dry. Its eyes seemed reflective but very dull, almost looked red, but I really couldn't say. I couldn't figure out if it was looking at me or not. Of course, with my luck, there wasn't another car in sight at the time. Now, I'm a fairly tough girl. I'm the strangely calm one in emergency situations. People who immediately panic really piss me off, and I even intentionally subject myself to scary things to desensitize myself. I'm very interested in this kind of stuff, but being stopped in front of this thing, some switch flipped. The instant I saw it, I felt warmth on my cheeks before I realized I was crying. In my head I'm yelling, "Go! Floor it!" But I just sit there, staring at this thing, and it stands and just turns to me slightly. I look down at the shifter, not wanting to get near this thing, considering turning around back to my friend's house. I put the car in first gear, looked back up, and the thing was gone. I immediately hauled ass back towards my house. The heater was on full blast, and I shivered the whole way home. Second story, the woods are deep. The woods are deep, my child. They are deeper than they are wide, deeper than any map could show. If you go in there now, you will not come out yourself. We were afraid that Granny was getting dementia, and statements like that weren't helping her case any. Granny, I've been in the woods loads of times. I've always come out myself. I patted my chest as if to prove it to her. Granny shook her head sadly. The woods are at some times deeper than at others. Now is such a time. That was how my summer started, with those ominous words. Even at age 11, I had the sense not to ask any follow-up questions. It wasn't tact, necessarily, but the desire to avoid a potentially awkward conversation. If Granny were ill, I didn't want to have to experience the symptoms firsthand. Granny had given plenty of mysterious warnings to me in the past. Warnings about boys and what they want from girls. Warnings about the taxman and the G-men. But Granny had never said anything quite like this. Of course, I had no intention of staying out of the woods. It was summertime, which meant unlimited freedom and exploration. The woods were not just 100 acres of trees and rocks. No, they were a universe of secret lairs and hidden temples. The woods were anything and everything my pre-adolescent imagination could concoct. I may not have had many friends in those days, but I had kingdoms full of loyal subjects in the woods. Every day that I was able, I spent in the woods. Sometimes my dad would have chores for me to do instead, but I still conspired to make it to that shady patch of oak trees anytime I could. I would pack a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a can of Coke in my school bag and head out. I didn't see anything strange in the woods, and by the time July rolled around I had all but forgotten Granny's words of warning. On one exceptionally hot day sometime after the 4th of July, I was helping my dad pick rocks out of the field. Picking up rocks was perhaps my least favorite activity in the world, and I couldn't understand why we did it. We didn't grow anything other than a few irritable cows, and surely they didn't mind a few rocks. My dad must have sensed my displeasure and took pity on me. "Why don't you run off now, April? Go play in the woods until supper time. Oh, and take your little brother with you." The elation that came from my dad's first 2 sentences was sapped by his last one. My brother Tyler was only 4 years old and afraid of his own shadow. I could already picture it in my head. I'd be trying to save a village from a marauding dragon, and he'd be crying his eyes out over a bug he saw. I couldn't see it working very well, but I knew better than to argue with my dad, especially after he had given me a reprieve from rock collecting. I collected Tyler, though he did not particularly want to go, and led him to the winding game trail that cut through our woods. I thought that I might get him interested in catching crawdads in the creek while I busied myself with more important things. Despite the intense sun of the day, the woods were dark and cool, with a few strands of light breaking through the dense oak canopy. I inhaled the familiar scent of earth and cedar, feeling completely at home. I tugged on Tyler's arm, urging him down the trail. I was anxious to get to the creek another half-hour's walk away. "Are there snakes out here?" Tyler asked, his little voice trembling slightly. "Don't be stupid. Of course there's snakes out here. Dangerous ones?" I shrugged. "Probably." Tyler gripped my hand tightly and slowed his pace. I turned to face him and knelt down. "No snakes are going to get you, okay? And no bugs or nothing like that. I promise it's safe, okay?" "But Granny said we shouldn't go in the woods. She said it was too dangerous for us." I groaned. "Yeah, well, Granny says a lot of stuff, and Dad said to take you with me. So who are you going to listen to?" Tyler's eyes widened, and his bottom lip trembled slightly. He whispered, "Dad," so quietly that I almost couldn't hear him, but it was enough for me to start walking again. We made it to the creek in near record time, a small miracle given the small human-shaped ball and chain I was dragging. I had big plans for the patch of cedars near the creek side, was just begging to become a magical fortress hideaway. I set Tyler up at the pleasantly burbling creek, with instructions to catch 17 crawdads before we could go home. My 11-year-old math told me that was the perfect number to ensure at least an hour of uninterrupted time to myself. I left him there alone while I walked the few yards to the cedar stand. I stopped and listened, making sure that I could hear him if something were to happen. I was caught up in my imaginary world almost instantly. So intently focused was I on rearranging the cedar boughs and clearing space for my castle hideaway that I didn't even notice the passage of time. Eventually, I began to note the lengthening shadows and golden light of late afternoon. That couldn't be right, could it? That meant that hours must have passed. But surely Tyler would have been yelling for me to take him back home by now. "Tyler?" I called out. I stood up in the cedar stand and listened. He made no response. And more than that, I noticed that the woods around me were absolutely quiet and still. Gone was the ever-present gurgle of the creek. No birds sang, and I couldn't even hear the sound of the wind among the tree branches. Just the suffocatingly loud silence. "Tyler!" I cried and ran the few yards back to the creek. Guilt and nausea enveloped me. If something had happened to him, and it was my fault, I couldn't even stomach the thought. I was simultaneously relieved and puzzled when I broke through the cedars to the bank of the creek. I had expected to find no one, but Tyler was there, squatting in the middle of the silently flowing water, staring blankly ahead. "Tyler? Tyler, what's going on?" He didn't respond, didn't turn to look at me. "Tyler, it's not funny. I'll tell Dad how you scared me." I approached him in the creek, reaching my hand out for his shoulder. His head turned slowly around to the side to face me. His eyes were wide and his round face had gone ghostly pale. "April," he said in a deeper monotone than his 4-year-old throat should be able to produce. "April, she's out here. She's out here with us." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Let's go, Tyler. Let's get home." I grabbed his hand roughly and pulled him to his feet. I didn't want to scare him, but I had to get us both out of the woods. We half ran, half walked along the game trail, slowing down periodically for Tyler to catch his breath and rest his short legs. Finally, he stopped altogether. "Tyler, come on. You can rest when we get home." He didn't respond, only shook his head slowly and pointed his chubby finger to a spot ahead of us on the trail. I sat down to his level and looked to where he was pointing. The trail curved around a rock outcrop, draped almost entirely in darkness by the early evening shadows. I had passed this spot so many times that I had it virtually memorized, but there was something off about it. I squinted, trying to discern what was different. Then I saw it. There in the shadows were two boulders joined. It was a figure, dark and nearly invisible in the fading light. It looked at first like a person sitting down with its knees drawn up to its chest, but that wasn't quite right either. I pulled Tyler close to me. As I sat wondering if it had seen us, wondering if we could escape into the woods undetected, it stood from its crouching position. I could see it clearly then, and I knew Tyler could too. He grabbed a hold of my hand more tightly, but remained silent. The thing in front of us was not a person, at least not in any way that I recognized. It had the general appearance of a woman from the waist up. Bright white, unkempt hair crowned a broad, flat face from which peered out two large yellow saucer eyes. She cradled in her arms what looked at first to be the remains of a coyote, but the bloody collar in the woman's claws indicated that it was a pet dog. I realized then that we had interrupted her feeding. The sight of her blood-smeared face made my breath catch in my throat, and I could feel hot tears begin to well up in my eyes. She cast the animal carcass aside and moved toward us with a painfully slow deliberation. Her movements were unnaturally stiff and jerky. I immediately saw why. Though she was taller than my dad, she moved on legs far too short for her torso, no more than 1.5 feet in length, and her two long arms swayed limply beside her lank body. I stumbled backward, pulling Tyler along with me. We backed down the trail as the thing approached. I moved my head back and forth, looking for an escape route in the dense vegetation around us, all while keeping an eye on her advancing form. Seeing a break in the bushes next to a fallen log, I roughly pulled Tyler through the brambles and off the game trail. Under cover of vegetation, I crouched, listening intently for the approach of whatever was out there. All I could hear was my own blood thrumming through my ears and the soft, barely perceptible whimpers coming from Tyler. We stayed squatting like statues in the bushes for what felt like hours. I could feel my muscles tense and ache from the position, and I knew Tyler must have been in pain as well. I knew that we could not stay in the woods too much longer. Soon it would be completely dark, and whatever that thing was, we had no chance of escaping it once the sun had set. I turned to Tyler and put my finger to my lips. He nodded, his eyes wide and rimmed with red from silently crying. I held his hand in mine, and together we began to slowly crawl through the bushes. The going was slow, due to the sheer denseness of the vegetation. I knew we'd never make it staying in the bushes, not with branches snagging our clothes and thorn bushes tearing at our skin. I planned to avoid the trail until we had cleared the outcropping, then meet up with it again after. That way we could hopefully remain unseen, but still make it home before dark. My plan had worked well up to a point. As we skirted the outcropping, I was relieved to see that no figure stood among the shadows. It looked as it always had, spheres and crags of granite, covered in lichen and moss. I sighed deeply and closed my eyes. In just a few more steps, we'd be clear of it and could run down the trail the rest of the way. I tightened my grip on Tyler's hand, urging him forward toward the trail. I paused and looked through the woods. There was nothing. No movement. No sound. I dropped Tyler's hand and cautiously stepped onto the worn dirt of the game trail. I motioned for Tyler to follow behind. We ran. We ran as fast and as hard as we could. I cast regular glances back at Tyler and slowed my pace when he fell behind. I wished I was strong enough to carry him. I could see the break in the woods up ahead, where our pasture slowly segued into our backyard. I couldn't help but run faster, not with safety so close. I could practically feel the sunlight on my face when I heard Tyler call out behind me. He had stumbled and was crying in a heap on the ground. I was so focused on getting back to him that I didn't notice the movement in the shadows until it was too late. As I reached Tyler, the long-armed thing emerged from the darkness along the trail. She smiled at me, the dried, rust-colored blood on her face cracking as she did so. I'll admit, I froze in fear, completely transfixed. She walked toward us while we sat there, in that same awful jerking gait. I could hear my heart pounding as she reached her clawed finger toward Tyler. That's what snapped me back to reality, to the danger before us. I grabbed him and pulled him up as she raked a single finger down the back of his shirt. She followed us as we fled, and though I did not turn around to look at her, I could feel her warmth at my back. We made it to the edge of the woods, and I shoved Tyler forward, out into the last dying rays of sunlight. As I moved to join him, I felt a sharp pain in my calf. The creature had lunged at me and ran her claw down the length of my leg. I could see a line of blood forming there as I kicked her away and stumbled out of the woods. I pulled Tyler a safe distance from the woods and held him as we both looked back at the figure retreating into the dense darkness there. The rest of the walk home was short, and I spent it convincing Tyler that he must not tell anyone about what we saw there. I couldn't imagine how much trouble I'd be in if anyone found out, and besides, I thought, who would believe us? As we approached our house, Tyler looked up at me. April? My back hurts. I lifted his shirt and saw that the thing had broken the skin with her claw. A small red welt was raised into Tyler's skin beneath the ripped fabric of his shirt. It's okay, Tyler. It's just a scratch. You'll be fine. April? Don't make me go into the woods again. Please. I held him tightly and promised that I never would, as long as I lived. When we got inside the house, Granny was sitting up in her recliner waiting for us. I tried to sneak past her, but she wouldn't have it. April, come here. I obeyed, signaling to Tyler to go get cleaned up without me. Yes, Granny? Why are you so messy? Have you been in the woods? Yes, Granny. But we were just playing out there. We lost track of time is all. She stared at me intently. Child, what have you done? I warned you that the woods are dangerous now. I nodded, trying my best to look appropriately reprimanded. She continued. There's another world, child. It's like our own, but not our own. It has its own rules, and sometimes, when everything aligns just so, it sends its people across. I hope, more than anything, that you never encounter such a person. She rocked unsteadily in her recliner and focused her eyes on mine. Child, these other people, they're not like us. They're vengeful and powerful. And once they've marked you, you are theirs forever. Once they've felt you, once they've tasted your blood, there is no escape. Mother, my dad bellowed from the doorway, you're scaring April with your nonsense. He turned to me. Go get cleaned up for supper, kiddo. And mother, please don't fill their heads with that stuff. That was 15 years ago. I never went back into the woods. Not after that. Tyler died at age 16. He was the passenger in a car driven by his best friend, Jason. Jason had been driving along a dirt road through the woods when he suddenly swerved into a tree. Tyler died on the way to the hospital, the EMTs said. He had spoken just once, painfully moving his broken jaw to say, April, she's out here with us. They asked me if his last words meant anything to me. I said they didn't. I talked to Jason at the hospital. He couldn't stop crying and apologizing. The nurses said he kept asking if the lady was okay. They were puzzled since there was no lady at the scene. I'm so sorry, April. I didn't mean for it to happen. There was this woman, just standing in the road. This white-haired lady. I was just trying to avoid her. April, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't hold Jason responsible. I know it wasn't his fault. It was her fault. And mine. I let her mark Tyler. I let her mark me. And now, I wait. Third story. There's something in the woods of West Virginia. I have been hesitant to tell anyone about this, but after confiding in a good friend and fellow Redditor, I was advised to post my story here in the hopes it might help others. I recently moved several miles up a hollow in West Virginia from a far more urban area. While anywhere in West Virginia is going to be close to a mountain, I now live in quite a secluded little valley with woods starting all of 20 feet out my back door. Since moving here, I've promised myself repeatedly to make use of local hiking trails and the like to finally whip my geeky self in a little bit better shape. After one trip into the woods, I don't think I'll ever be going back. A derecho had just swept through the state and caused massive damage. Trees and power lines were down everywhere. Since my house was going to be hot as hell with no AC and 95+ degree heat, I decided that was the day to finally go for a hike and kill some time while waiting for the power to come on. I told my wife, Sarah, the plan and invited her to bring our daughter, 18 months, along to explore the woods. The heat having sapped any semblance of motivation she may have had, she declined to join me, preferring to stay home with our daughter to splash around in the baby pool. As I was putting on my boots to head out, my wife came inside with a slightly concerned look on her face. She told me she'd just seen some sort of FBI agent or something hanging around behind the pine tree in our front yard. I went outside with her to check it out. I walked all around the tree and found no one there. I called back to the house to ask if she were sure that was where she'd seen him, as I couldn't even find evidence of footprints or anything in the pine needles on the ground. She assured me she had, but she looked even more bewildered and confused. After some gentle prodding, she told me she'd seen his face coming from behind the stump of a branch that had fallen in the storm. Now, I'm a pretty short guy, only about 5 feet 4 inches, but the branch she was talking about was a good 3 to 4 feet above my head. Chalking it all up to a little disaster-inspired paranoia, I assured her there was no one on our property. We made sure neighbors were still home and told them about the guy potentially lurking around, and received multiple assurances they would keep an eye out. With my wife comforted, I left her to tend our little one and headed for the woods. I didn't, but should have noticed a bush at the corner of our house infested with moths. A lot of branches and whole trees had fallen, making the common trails pretty impassable. There was something about the day that kept me determined to keep going. I began to make my own path in the woods between blocked trails, being sure to note landmarks and sun position so I wouldn't get lost. I came upon one clear trail that, after a few dozen feet, was blocked by a highly tangled mass of trees and branches. What was strange was that they did not appear to have fallen, but been more woven together. It was like a natural wall. I stood for a moment, unsure of why seeing this had caused my entire body to break out in goosebumps. The sun must have gone behind a cloud because it suddenly seemed darker and a little colder. That's when I saw the eyes. Red, unblinking, and definitely inhuman eyes were staring at me from behind the edge of the wall. The face was round and pale. I couldn't see the detail on the nose and mouth, if it even had them. I blinked and the face seemed to disappear. I slowly edged closer with every sensible bone in my body telling me to run back home. My curiosity vetoed those feelings. There was a climbing vine with flowers on it growing beside the wall, probably why it took me so long to see the face to begin with. Where the face had been, I now found a plain white doll. Its torso, arms, and legs were all much longer than they should be, and the face was perfectly smooth with no detail whatsoever. Attached to the doll was a white card. In some sort of black ink or marker were the words "Beware," with an X'd-out circle beside it. On the bottom part of the card was an oval with 2 red dots midway up it, a simplistic drawing of the face I had seen. At this point, I was honestly pretty scared. First seeing a stranger outside my house, now having some albino weirdo following me around leaving mangled, homemade toys with creepy notes. I dealt a lot when I was younger with people pushing me around, so I wasn't about to let some creep ruin my hike. I told myself I was falling victim to the same paranoia as my wife. We were not able to call for help, after all. With all the lines being down, I decided to continue my hike. I sat on a rock and had some of the bottled water I'd brought with me. My heart started to slow down, and I began to feel a little silly for the fear I had been feeling. Clearly, some local kids decided to take advantage of the situation and mess with the new guy in the neighborhood. Resolving to find a way to pay them back, I got up to continue my hike when I heard the snap of a twig coming from behind me. Startled, I whipped around and saw the FBI agent my wife had seen not 10 feet from me, standing on the trail. Only I could see now, as my blood ran cold, that he was in no way even human. He appeared to be wearing a suit, but it could just have easily been his skin. Almost 9 feet tall, his arms reached nearly to the ground. His face was perfectly smooth. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, no ears. Despite this, I could feel the intensity of his stare. I was more frightened than I had ever been before. Every fiber of my being was telling me to run, to get away, to do anything in my power to remove this monster from my vision. But I was held to the ground as if I had been glued there. That's when I noticed the blood at his feet, the disturbing mass of rubbery-looking wet tubes that, I realized with a rush of bile to my throat, could very well have been human intestines. I don't know how long the standoff continued. After a moment, the paralysis I felt seemed to abate. I thought fast. Sudden movement might invite action on the part of the tall man facing me. What action that might be I could not imagine, but I knew somehow it could not be good. With shaking hands, I fumbled for the cell phone in my pocket. Though I would get no signal out here, the camera still worked. Slowly, so slowly, I fumbled to hit the record button without taking my eyes off him. I held the phone up and glanced, ever so briefly, at the screen. Nothing but static. But now he and his gory mess was gone. My paralysis left with him. I scrambled to my feet and started to run when I realized I had no idea where I was. The wall of woven trees and branches wasn't there, but neither was the path it had blocked. The rock I had rested on to drink my water was not there. As far as I could tell, I was in a completely different part of the woods. I won't lie, at this point I thought I was never going to see my wife and child again. I was being stalked by some insane man in a bad Halloween costume, or worse, a monster the likes of which the world had never, as far as I knew at the time, seen before. After a few minutes of trying to decide what to do, I resolved myself to get out of this, and get out of it alive. Just in case, I typed out a note on my cell phone, long since returned to normal, briefly describing the being I had seen, and making sure my family knew the love I had for them and the regret I had going into the woods. I put the phone in sleep mode to preserve the battery as much as possible and proceeded in what I hoped was the direction home. For a few minutes, everything seemed fine. Then I realized I was being stalked. I kept hearing odd noises around me. Every time I would glance in the direction of the noise, I would see that same blank stare from behind a tree or a bush. Only once did I see the being in full again, perhaps 5 feet away. I had briefly stopped in my hike to get my bearings when I had that being watched feeling. When I turned around, I fell straight onto my ass with the tall man within easy reach. But still he did not move, other than to very, very slowly tilt his head sideways. There was a strange whispering noise and a mass of long, fluid-like tentacles sprouted from his back, branching out to the sides and writhing in the air. I screamed. I'm not sure what happened next. I found myself sitting, leaning against a tree, sobbing uncontrollably. Never before in my life had terror so gripped me. I did not know how to react. You never understand fight or flight until you're faced in a real situation like this. I guess I chose flight because I was again alone, again in unfamiliar territory. I looked down at my arms. I began to sob again, unable to help myself. All over my arms were written one word in black ink, over and over again: run. I ran. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't really care. I just wanted to see my daughter, my wife, my mother, any friendly face I could find. My feet pounded in the dirt. The ground was still wet in many places from the storm. I lost count of the times I fell in the mud. I lost track of time. My lungs were burning. My knees were wobbling and about to give out, but the pounding terror in my head and in my heart would not allow me to even slow down. I burst into a clearing and fell again as I tried to skid to a stop. At first I thought I had come again face to face with the tall man. But this was different. Perhaps 7 feet tall. It seemed like an alabaster white man with giant wings, also perfectly porcelain white. The only detail that stood out were the glowing red eyes. We stayed like that for a moment before it walked towards me. I jumped to my feet, ready to run again, when the thing rushed me. Before I could move, it had grabbed me and thrown me behind it. I landed with a very hard thump on the ground. I scrambled to turn over and look at the creature. That was when I realized it was not me it was staring at. Not me, it was rushing. The tall man had been right behind me. My mind, briefly cleared enough of fear and adrenaline to think, finally recognized the pale creature as the first face I had seen at the trail. The creature that had given me the warning. The two beings stood facing each other for a bare heartbeat. The tentacles came whipping and thrashing from the tall man's back. Again a pause as nothing happened. The wings of the white creature slowly beat the air. Suddenly a tentacle whipped forward, its point driving at the face of the white creature. One of the giant, moth-like wings curled inward and whipped back out, deflecting the tentacle. Not just deflecting it, but shattering it. The pieces of the tentacles wavered and dissipated before they ever touched the ground. I jumped to my feet and gave an involuntary whoop of victory on behalf of my strange, otherworldly protector. This was clearly a mistake. The heads of both creatures snapped straight to me. Tentacles from the tall man darted in my direction. The face of the white creature split open at the bottom, and it roared at me, what I took as a warning. It managed to use its wing to deflect the tentacles. It leapt forward, its arms wrapping around the tall man, its wings encapsulating the tentacles. With a shimmering upward rush, as if taking off at great velocity, they both vanished. I passed out. When I woke, I had again moved. But now I recognized everything. In fact, I had gone from a few miles in the woods to perhaps a few tens of feet in the woods, just behind my house. I staggered to my feet and made my way home. The sun was setting. I had been gone all day, but only had memories to account for perhaps half that. When my wife saw me, she asked if I'd had a good day playing in the woods. I glanced down. The words were gone from my arms, but my body was still covered in mud. I somehow managed to smile to her, determined to keep the horrors I'd witnessed to myself. I told her the woods turned out not to be for me. Fourth story. My father let the Mothman in. I never felt comfortable around my father. As far back as I can remember, I didn't like being in a room with him. Apparently neither did my mother, or any of our family for that matter. He was not a stern man, even given his military background, nor was he truly loathsome in any other way. The fact was that he was distant. When I grew up, it was far more common for fathers to be seemingly entirely absent. My friends at the time had fathers who were truckers, traveling salesmen, and the upper-scale executive fathers were sometimes even less present. My father was present, but there was always something missing, always something in his eyes that made it clear that his mind was elsewhere. Even the best moments of my life were haunted by something he had lost. Now, after his passing, I may finally understand why. 1 year after his death, which was one day after his 99th birthday, I found a letter addressed to me. It was the last day of the estate sale, and it fell from atop his bookcase as I moved it from the wall. I opened it immediately. The contents of the first page were simple, clearly legible, and centered on the page. Find someone who will listen and tell them this story. That is why I am here. In the hopes that someone will listen. I cannot take the time to write everything contained in that opus of tiny letters. I can, however, begin. My father was 20 years old when he was stationed in West Virginia in 1942. I had never gotten a sense of his intelligence, but apparently he was a young prodigy. He had been accepted into a chemistry program at Brown University before his 14th birthday. By the time he was 18, he had graduated and immediately joined the military. His career, of course, was quite different from a typical recruit, and he found himself in research and development of fringe materials. From the contents of the letter, I gather that the U.S. government and military at any given time have discovered a number of formerly unknown elements. Many are eventually publicly discovered and added to the periodic table, But the government on average makes these discoveries decades before the public sector. It was this program that my father found himself in. He included the name of the division in his letter, but asked that I leave this detail out of what I publish. He explained that he wanted the story to be known, but also felt that certain pieces would very likely put me and others at risk. Apparently, this work was being conducted under his tutelage in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The facilities were located far beneath a group of bunkers storing TNT. TNT was being produced at this site, but it was only a cover for the more complex work being conducted below. My father had helped to discover a new stable liquid element with strange properties. Up until this point, only a microscopic amount had been created due to the lengthy and intensive process. My father mentioned that at the time, the electricity cost to generate just a few molecules had been over almost $1 million. At the time, this was quite extreme. But there, in West Virginia, he had his lab and everything he needed to produce liters of the liquid to be divided and studied by several anxious teams. The results of the initial study on this liquid revealed that it had some extraordinary properties. For one, the effect of gravity on the liquid was unstable somehow. The molecules would rise and fall in waves and patterns that no one could attribute to any other cause. Secondly, the mere presence of just a few molecules seemed to increase the activity of particles around it. Today, this is called quantum fluctuation. At the time, they termed it physicality instability. Particles of matter near the NX, which it had been designated, seemed to blink out of existence, while others appeared randomly. 6 months into production, he had managed to produce a liter of NX and had it spread in a thin circular pool to be sectioned off. Only he and 2 officers were present for this, but there is no chance of corroboration. My father saw the liquid begin to stir slightly, like oil shimmering in a pan. Only it was dead black. Intricate patterns spread through its surface, and a humming noise filled his head. The officers at his sides looked at him and each other, clearly noticing something out of the ordinary. It was then that the pool began to rise. In moments, the bubble that had been forming at its center became a head and a face, followed by a monstrously winged body. The thing that rose from that pool was well over 6 feet tall, with 2 ragged folded wings, a slender body, and bright red luminescent eyes. My father described feeling the entire world turn inside his gut as that thing emerged, like it had warped his very being in presenting itself. The sound of his officers' bodies dropping to the concrete jolted him out of his frozen rigidity. The creature stepped down and walked toward the exit slowly and casually. Overcome by the events, but now somewhat present, my father stopped him short and shouted one single question as the creature opened the door to the hallway. Who? It was all he could possibly formulate. The creature turned. His eyes brightened in intensity. With no visible indication of speech, my father heard this phrase clearly in his head. I am what you see. The creature then exited the room. My father fell to assist the officers on either side of him, each of whom were deceased. The autopsy later confirmed that they had each had an identical aneurysm. From this point, the story gets quite complex. Some of it was reported on the news. Other parts are in police files, and versions of it have been made into books and movies. The truth and detail behind the events in Point Pleasant up to the final tragedy remain unknown. But they will not remaining unknown for any longer. The public must know, because Point Pleasant was just the start. 5th story. I found a journal in an abandoned hospital. I aimed my phone torch to the large gap in the fence. Over here, I whispered to my friends, there's a way in. We took turns squeezing through the narrow opening in the metal gate and began walking silently to the derelict building. From there, We managed to slip in through a broken window which previous explorers had gained access through. The inside was pitch black, with an expected damp, musty fragrance. Inglesfield Hospital had been abandoned for over 20 years, and the building had certainly seen better days. The three of us continued down the hallway, with only the lights from our phones illuminating our way. We explored every room we came across, finding a lot of satanic and lewd graffiti decorating the shedding walls. Millie didn't like that, but Harry assured her it was just other explorers messing around, and to not be a wimp. Moving quickly and quietly, we found ourselves in a large room which appeared to be a ward. Some of the beds were overturned, and there were some filthy gowns strewn across the floor. I began walking around, stepping over fallen cubicle curtains when something caught my eye. A brown, leathery object slightly peeking out from under the mattress of one of the beds. I walk over to retrieve it, almost tripping on the curtain as I do so. It was a book. I go to open it, but Harry impatiently hurries us on to the next room. I place the book down on the bed and turn away, but I'm instantly drawn back to it, as if an invisible hand is guiding me to it, willing me to take it. I slip the book into my coat pocket, cursing my fucking curiosity. We soon found ourselves in some sort of office. Millie came across a dusty file cabinet filled with patient records. We began to curiously flick through them when Harry called out from a room down the corridor, forcing us to abandon our snooping. We reunite with Harry, who stood in front of an open fridge. "Look at this," he beckons. "What do you reckon's in here?" Millie held her nose as she approached. "Ugh, it stinks." I had to agree. An occupied sealed fridge that hasn't had power for decades certainly holds an odor. We shone our lights over the multiple opaque jars which inhabited the fridge, unable to see what, if anything, was in them. "Oh, Harry, just close it. It's disgusting," Millie whined. "I just want to see what's in here," Harry replied. "Maybe there's something at the back." Harry unexpectedly reached his hand in, causing Millie to squeal. "Are you insane? That's disgusting, now stop it." She poked Harry sharply in the ribs, causing him to recoil back and send a jar tumbling out of the fridge and onto the floor with a smash. A dark liquid splashed over him. We all aimed our torches down in unison, but before anyone could say a word, the smell hit us. Harry heaved. Millie screamed and I began making a run for the exit, the others following not far behind. We dove out the broken window at inhuman speeds and began gulping the fresh air. "What was that? Was that a fucking brain?" Millie asked through breaths. "I don't know, but it stank. Why did you make me do that, you twat? That shit went in my mouth and eye and everywhere." Harry hissed at her, doubled over and looking rather pale. In the distance, we heard dogs barking. "Right, let's go," I announce, as we all hastily retreat. It took about an hour for us all to get home. I quietly snuck straight to my room, not wanting to draw attention from my parents who were already in bed. I slipped off my clothes and slid into bed, exhausted. 2 days passed without much excitement, and I decided to walk to the shop to get some snacks just to get out of the house for a bit. I pull on a pair of jeans and a shirt and begin looking for my coat within the mess on the floor. I find it by the side of my bed and begin to put it on when my hand hits against something firm in the pocket. The book. I whisper out loud as I remove it from my pocket, the curiosity reigniting inside me. I threw my coat back on the floor, sat at my desk, and opened it. It was a handwritten journal, with the words Robert Palmer, 1987 foot scribbled on the inside cover in black ink. February 17th, 1987, day 1 of 5. You'll have to excuse my rushed handwriting. I was informed when signing up for this trial that all outside communications are prohibited, so I'm discreetly jotting down in here to relieve some boredom and savor this oh-so-thrilling memory. I've put myself forward for a medical trial. I'm told it involves an injection today and 4 days of progress monitoring. Sounds dull, but I'm being given £2,000 just to lay in a hospital bed for a week, so I will grin and bear it. I'm on a shared ward with 2 other men and 3 ladies. It's peculiar for us to be mixed in the same ward, but we're all separated by curtains, so can't complain. The hospital have fed us a hearty lunch, and we're gradually being called to have our injections. February 18th, 1987, day 2 of 5. The trial did not tell us the injection site was going to be in the eye. I protested, but I'd already signed a contract along with everyone else. We're now all sat in the ward with fucking eye patches on and feeling deceived. But I remind myself of the £2,000 and try to stay positive. I briefly interacted with the other participants in this shitty trial. The woman opposite me is called Linda, and the man next to me is Wendell. I have not yet caught the names of the others. February 19th, 1987, day 3 of 5. I was woken at 6 in the morning to the woman in the first bed screaming. I heard nurses run in, and moments later it was silent with the sounds of a bed being wheeled away. Linda and the woman next to her said they think she was sedated and taken away. Perhaps she had a mental breakdown? I still couldn't. I had to stop writing abruptly earlier as a nurse unexpectedly walked in. The man next to Wendell had pressed his emergency call button and explained to the nurse he felt hot and unwell. The nurse suddenly restrained the man to his bed hurriedly. The man began letting out an abnormal growl, and I heard the bed violently shaking as he was being wheeled away. What the fuck is this? February 20th, 1987, day 4 of 5. My writing will be scribbles. I'm shaking very hard. Myself, Wendell, and Linda are the only ones left on the ward. In the night, the woman next to Linda got out of bed and fled into the corridor to, what sounded like, primitively attack a nurse. She did not return. A man in a white coat came in to talk to us. He looked disappointed. He told us that the drugs trial has failed, and any negative effects are irreversible. He acted more like a stroppy toddler who didn't get his own way than a medical professional. Linda asked what this means for us. The bastard looked at her and shrugged. He told us the 3 other patients did not survive, and 1 nurse has also had to be destroyed due to contamination, but some of their organs will be transported to another facility for further testing. He then apologized and left. The 3 of us have been restrained to our beds. I have very limited movement in my hands. Inglesfield is not a hospital. It's a fucking experiment facility. There is no money. We are just lab rats. Our kin will receive news that we passed from a reaction to the medicine, and there can be no lawsuit as we signed away our rights. I doubt anyone will read this. I regret this. February 21st, 1987, day 5 of 5. We lost Wendell in the early hours of last night. He told me he felt like he was burning, before growling and shaking violently. We were left in the room with him for nearly 20 minutes, terrified he was going to break free of his restraints and harm us. Wendell managed to pull the curtain between us down. His eyes were fully black and his mouth was wider than possible, and the demonic sounds he was emitting was haunting. The nurses ignored our pleas. If this is my fate, I'd rather just be put down now than go through that. But we were ignored, as if we'd been given up on now. It's getting late now. I'm feeling very hot. I don't know what to do. I closed the diary with wide eyes. Surely this must be a prank? But the book looked so aged that it was hard to convince myself it was a hoax. I opened my laptop and searched up Inglesfield Hospital. There were hardly any results. just that it suddenly closed due to unknown circumstances. I grabbed my phone and called Millie. She answered, and before she could finish her greeting, I told her everything I just read. Millie sounded genuinely concerned and reminded me of what we'd found in the fridge. She told me to call Harry. I obeyed, briefly hanging up on her to dial Harry's number. No answer. I try again. Nothing. I try several more times before calling Millie. "Oh, let's just go over to his," Millie insisted. "I'll meet you on his road in 10. Millie eventually jogged up to Harry's road to meet me. "He's probably just still asleep, but you've scared me now," Millie scolded me. All this talk of brains and demon zombie shit. We got to Harry's house and knocked on the door. No answer. We knock again, louder. Nothing. "Maybe they're out?" I suggest, but Millie was already heading around the house to the back gate. I followed her. "All the cars are here," Millie told me. "Plus they know us well enough. They never mind when we let ourselves dash." Millie stopped in her tracks after turning the corner. I caught up to her and followed her gaze. The glass back door was completely smashed, and a large blood trail led off beyond the garden. I slowly walked closer to the door, Millie still frozen in fear. Just inside the door, I saw the faceless remains of Harry's mother. My jaw dropped, and I let out an audible gasp. This caused his mother to slowly distort her head to look at me. She weakly began to crawl towards me, her eyeless face searching for me, but her body barely able to move from being heavily stripped of flesh. I ran. I grabbed Millie firmly by the arm and ran. I didn't stop running until we were at mine. Without hesitation, I called the police and told them everything, Millie staring at me with unspoken horror. By the time investigators got to Inglesfield Hospital, it was ablaze. The amber flames dancing around everything that was left of the hospital. Harry's mother's remains were dealt with and cremated, along with his younger brother, who was found in a similar condition upstairs. Harry, his father and sister were never found.